And welcome back. Now, our guest speaker is a leader who has spent more than 25 years promoting human rights, gender equality, and sustainable development. And indeed, she spent the majority of her career with the United Nations in so many roles. We're going to hear a little bit about that in just a few minutes, but she is now the CEO of Plan International. So I really want to welcome to us Anne-Birgette Albrectsen. So thank you so much for joining us. And it's Anne-Birgette, but AB to all of her friends and colleagues. And now to all of us, to our dear audience, it'll be AB. So I want to welcome you.
Thanks, Edna. Wonderful to be here with you today.
Now, obviously, the work you've been doing over the years has been so powerful in terms of your work with the United Nations and, you know, with the sustainable development data, with the funds, with various things that you've been working with. But now your role as CEO of Plan International. This may not be as obvious to many of our viewers and our listeners out there. So perhaps you can bring us up to date in terms of the work that you're doing right now with Plan International.
Thank you very much, Edna, for that question. So Plan International is a private organization that has worked for 83 years on humanitarian and development work, focusing largely on the most vulnerable children in the world. Over the past 10 years, we have, while we still work with both boys and girls, our emphasis has been on how we remove all the barriers that particularly girls face in life so that they can enjoy the same rights as their brothers and male family members. So we work in almost 60 countries around the world, on all continents, and reach about 50 million children every year. So I'm very proud to be working for this private organization.
And indeed it is. It's such a priority. I think it's in our promo video. It's so lovely if you listen to it. That one of our colleagues from India, when he said there are only two words in terms of development, and it is educate girls, and it always rings out, I think, so clear. When you look at this and we see, I think, the difference around the world, and it's something, of course, at the very heart of ABLF Talks and what we do here when it comes to this is, where have you seen a difference in countries that are possibly seen as more progressive and you know, it's so normal to most people around the world that of course you would educate your girls. Why would you not?
Well, unfortunately, there are communities, families, societies across most parts of the world that think twice sometimes before they send their girls to school just because they're girls. Girls are generally not equally heard, seen, and valued. And let's remember that even in my home country, Denmark, which is often put very high on the progressive list, while all girls go to school, women and men are not equally valued or remunerated, and gender inequality still exists even here. So I think what I've learned over the year is the best way to address issues relating to gender equality is to make sure that we all know that we're in the same boat and we're not pointing fingers in any particular way, but we all need to live together.
It's so true, and indeed I think we all need to remember that it's about a society change, it's a transition, and I think it's not that long ago, you know, in other countries whereby you know, I think that the role of women wasn't as normal and as prominent as it's becoming, and it's not there yet. It's yes, you mentioned that too. So it's still ongoing throughout the world. But talk to us. Let's put this in terms of perspective when we're looking at, you know, I suppose the slowdown that the pandemic has caused around the world in so many areas. And we are going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously, and its role too as well. So when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the fact that perhaps some have been, I don't know, maybe held back just because of what's actually happened, the big danger is how can we get governments back on track again? Because the danger is maybe they've slowed down and some maybe are using it as an excuse not to get back on. It's absolute. Would you agree it's essential we get them back on track?
Absolutely, Edna. I mean, we're looking at, I mean, for somebody like me that's worked in the development field for almost 30 years, when I see statistics like the Gates Foundation put out that we have lost 25 years of development gains in 25 weeks. That was the figure they put out during the early lockdowns in 2020. We obviously have to focus on this, and our absolute priority across the world has to be getting back on track quickly. Now, how do we do that? I mean, I think with the scale of the setback that many countries, many societies, many individuals are experiencing, governments need to think very, very differently. And the first place to start is making sure that we measure what we want. We know that if we don't measure, for example, how different policies and the impact of COVID and the various aspects of the SDGs, if we don't differentiate between how our progress is impacting genders, age, different ethnicities, etc., then we will always be leaving people behind. So we need to put an absolute focus on making sure that we measure what we want. The second thing that we need to do is say, well, in a resource-constrained environment that most economies will be in over the next few years, we cannot simply try and make that money stretch thinner across everything, because then we won't get there. So we have to make sure that we're investing in resilience building, in safety nets, in making sure that we are not short-changing education and health, but also looking at things that we know will really be accelerants to economies, like investing in girls and women, girls' education, and enabling women to be active participants in the labor force. Because if we're not unlocking that potential, we're actually also stifling our economic progress. And then, of course, it's a fantastic opportunity to take what we've learned over the last year and think differently about how we produce, how we travel, how we emit CO2, etc. And the green transformation that many governments are beginning to look at will enable both more jobs and a different kind of growth.
But it's so distressing to actually hear that a lot of the development work that has been done, so much of it that took so long, can be undone so quickly. I mean, it's been tragedy after tragedy indeed around the world, you know, but also, yes, the vaccines are coming on board, but also there's been sort of COVID-induced financial distress around the world. And perhaps talk to me about this, where you see this impacting children's education particularly, and the longer term damage that this can do.
Yeah, thank you, Edna, again. I mean, you've pointed to the fact that there is the financial distress, but there really is also a deep crisis in education. We've got to remember that most kids were out of school for a shorter or longer period during 2020. Many have never come back. We are talking across Latin America, many countries in Africa, and some countries in Asia. We've only seen very timid re-entrance of children into school. And before we started with this particular moment in time, already 130 million girls were not in school. And that's been exacerbated by this break in education, because we know that it's so hard for girls to stay in school. They have to overcome so many barriers. And the Malala Fund has estimated that probably approximately 20 million secondary school-age girls will never come back to the classrooms. The other impacts, so there's an impact on access and retention of girls and boys in school. There's the issue of having lost out on education for a while and not being able to catch up. There's the particular issue of a lot of the distance learning that was put in place during this particular time didn't reach, of course, the poorest in society. They didn't reach those that are off the grid and don't have internet access. They also, the fact that girls are not always those that have the easiest access to technology in the family, so that had an impact. And then the third one I just want to highlight is that schools for many children, boys and girls, but in particular girls, is a protective space. It's a space where they are protected from violence, from abuse in public spaces, and also from abuse at home. So the schools are an escape from violence. And it's also a place where they gain access to information that may not be accessible at home, because parents protect their daughters and sons from information that will give them life skills in the future, including a comprehensive sexuality education and other things, etc. So the protective space that schools can be for children has been taken away. So a lot of different dimensions of impact.
And I think sometimes we really forget about that, and we particularly forget about that in the developed world, because life is it can be tough, but it carries on as normal, I think, and we have a lot of advantages and a lot of privileges that you so rightly point out there that are not there for so many young children around the world. One other area you look at and talk about too, and I'd like you to perhaps address it, is how differently has the pandemic impacted gender roles and equality? Have you seen issues there, particularly in Asia as well?
Yeah, so let me just start where I stopped before, which is that in many ways there are not huge differences between Asia and the West in terms of gender norms, values, etc. It's still the women that carry the majority of the care burden across the world. And of course, when you then have a pandemic and kids are home from school, and then it's generally the woman or the elder sister, the wife or the elder sister, that picks up that burden. So that has happened all over the world. But of course, we're looking at some countries in Asia with low-income countries or fragile economies. There's been an explosion in what I'd call the negative coping mechanisms, subjecting girls and young women to child marriage, trafficking, exploitation. We've seen that across some countries in Asia, as well as on other continents. I just want to highlight again what the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, has called the parallel or the shadow pandemic, the explosion in gender-based violence. And many girls, women in Asia, as well as in the West, have been locked down with their abusers, and domestic violence has absolutely exploded all over the world.
That's just it's devastating, and again, I think so few people are aware of that in many ways. And again, the work that you're doing, of course, it's probably kind of hitting your headlines more than it ever has before too. But talk to me again about how perhaps the pandemic has impacted your ability to do work at Plan International, and particularly when you're looking at and you're putting your efforts and energy into the rights of children and the rights of girls in terms of education and freedom and all of that. How have you been able to cope as an organization?
In different ways. So on the positive side, let me say that we are phenomenally lucky to have a very loyal group of individual and institutional supporters, including some in Dubai, and we're very lucky to have that support. Financially, we have been able to, at least for now, weather some of the early distress that we saw. So that's good. The other thing is that the pandemic and everything around it, in many ways, has been a huge revealer of existing inequalities in societies. So we're also seeing a greater focus by a number of governments, a number of our partners on how to remove the barriers for addressing systemic inequalities in countries. So there's been a call for our services. Governments have turned to us to help deliver essential PPE equipment, to help educate communities on hygiene, on addressing the immediate impact in terms of food insecurity. Cash has become and cash transfers and delivery mechanisms for that is something that governments across the world have looked to the international civil society community to help them address, because no government have been able to address the particular needs on their own. So there's been quite a large demand for our way of working. Now, of course, it's also meant that we have had to pivot really quickly, deliver sometimes digitally, everything from how we work with children impacted by violence. For 10, 20, 30 years, we've been working with hotlines for children and women that can call and get support, and they have been massively activated, and we have found new ways of working. We've been helping young activists and advocates for girls' rights be active during lockdown, safely use social media, be able to connect with each other, stay engaged in the public discourse about how to address the pandemic. But obviously, during some periods, we have had to completely shut down activity as lockdown came to the communities in which we work. But we've tried to be as helpful to governments, to partner organizations as possible during this particular time. But it's been a busy year of adapting to this very different reality.
Indeed, I'm getting some questions in from our dear audience now, so I want to put a few of them to you, because it's great that people are engaged, and indeed they're engaged from around the world, which is really very exciting for us. And we've seen this development at the ABLF Talks, so I'm so happy that we do have such great engagement from around the world. So to all of our audience out there, thank you so much for being with us. I have a question here from Mark David from Toronto, and he talks about the resilience of young people and how it can play a role in really lifting communities up and increasing awareness about socioeconomic issues. And we've witnessed it with activists such as Greta Thunberg and Malala. What are the ways in which, you know, we can maybe help to raise more empowered youth? And it's interesting he mentions Malala, if I might just say that her father, I have had the joy of meeting him several times, and of course he was a school teacher in Pakistan. And, you know, he was a more enlightened man, and his wife as well. They've been in Dubai, and they were just at the Emirates Festival of Literature, and he was talking about this very thing too. So they got a lot of, you know, backlash against them. But there's also, perhaps you might address the need for, you know, the attitude of parents in terms of also, you know, how do we empower the young? And it's a role of education, I guess, but also, as you say, sometimes school is a safe haven, and when they come home, they may not have this support. What do you think?
Yeah, I love the question, and we're probably seeing across the world, you know, a better educated and more civic, engaged and active youth than we have seen maybe in 30, 40 years. And we've all rejoiced at the leadership of young women across a whole range of social justice issues. So that's fantastic. We've also seen, not just during COVID-19, but also during natural disasters and other setbacks in communities, that kids generally are hugely resilient. They are optimistic. They always want to go back to school as soon as possible. That's the first. If you talk to refugee girls in the camps in Bangladesh, in informal settings in Mozambique, the first thing they tell you after a crisis and a setback is, I want to go back to school. So they have this drive for education. And we need that true intergenerational dialogue about how the kids and youth of today can be seen not as the troublemakers, but as the as the drivers of transformation for the future. They're innovative, they're close to their own problems, they want to be part of setting an agenda. And if we can build an education system fit for the future, that builds creativity, innovation, active citizenry, to ensure that the youth feel a responsibility for building that future that we all want for them, and we allow them to sit at the table, listen to them. Local government brings them in, not in a tokenistic way, but really listening to them. Then we have a real chance to accelerate the kind of societal transformation and build the resilience that we all so desperately need.
I think it is slowly happening in some areas, and we even see with the UN, I mean, including the youth there in terms of giving them a voice. World Economic Forum's begun to do it in recent years. So at that level, it's clear to people that some people are listening, but I think we need to probably see it right across the board. I have a question here from Drishti Iswani from Bangalore. How can organizations like Plan B International ensure that international cooperation and humanitarian programs take a rights-based approach to gender equality?
Great question. It's obviously something that Plan International has worked on itself and its own programming for many years. I mean, we helped shape the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have adopted that convention, as well as the Convention on Ending Discrimination Against Women, as our two foundational pillars for our work. And when we talk about a rights-based approach, what it really is about is it's not about standing on the street and shouting about the rights of children or women. It's about making sure that the governments, who after all, most of them have ratified these conventions, and promised their citizenry that they will protect their rights in accordance with these conventions, that the governments, the local authorities, etc., are aware of what those conventions mean, that they are supported when they so wish to advance innovative ideas for bringing those rights forward. But it's also about making sure that kids and parents and teachers, etc., in school know about their rights, are helped to claim those rights, whether it's access to fresh water or healthcare or education, or other political rights, that they are helped to engage and claim those rights. So it really is a symbiosis between governments that have signed up to human rights conventions and their citizenry in terms of how do we make these rights come alive. It's not easy. So it's not about, again, one part of the world or one organization like Plan claiming to be the holder of all the knowledge or the right to point fingers at others, but really, we have to collaborate. We have to help across different sectors, the public, the private, the non-profit sectors, to make sure that we pave this way for everybody to be able to live with the human rights that are there for them.
And indeed, as you say, too, some of those human rights are quite basic, and they're what so many of us would take for granted. So it's very, very sad when we think that actually these are not afforded to everybody in every country. So another question here, almost following on from that, from Shika in Dubai. In the past, you've spoken about how governments must play a more active role in protecting individuals, as well as the necessity of cooperating with the private sector to create safe digital content for the youth. How can governments enhance their role in this effort?
Really important question. Plan International released a report in October last year that pointed to the fact that girls all over the world and we did a huge survey of 11,000 girls and young women last year. 60% of them have experienced abuse and harassment online. What we've also heard from those girls and young women that we work with, of course, is that during COVID-19, where most societal services moved online, including education, that number has grown. So we've got a vast part of society that when they enter the digital space, they are subject to abuse and harassment. And of course, if they're active, if they state their views on gender equality or climate change or take the floor in a public way, that abuse goes up manyfold. So it's a real issue. And most countries in the world lack legislation that acknowledges that abuse and harassment is as damaging on the individual as abuse and harassment in the real space. Somehow, most legislation does not cover the virtual space, but we see that the impact of this harassment, 20% of the girls have lower educational attainment, 40% lose self-esteem, many stop going onto the digital space. So it's a real issue. So we need legislation, we need pressure on the social media platforms to make sure that they have adequate reporting mechanisms and that they address this abuse, and that they publish reports on the abuse so that it becomes a transparent issue and something that everybody can see. So governments have a huge role right now and in the near future to regulate the digital online space to make sure that it's safe for everybody.
Indeed, yes, it can be a great force for good, but unfortunately in some areas, you know, I can see the pressure, and it's horrific when we think about it and, you know, just think of the impact that it can have particularly. We're going to wrap up now, sadly, but just a quick wrap, if you could, in terms of responding to Ali Mohammed's question here, in terms of how successful you have been in aligning the goals for Plan International with the UN SDGs and shifting the organization's focus and strategy on achieving the global goals. So in 1 minute.
Yes, the SDGs are absolutely core to our mission. We adopted a new strategy 4 years ago where they were centered around them. Our focus was from day one to think about how can a large global organization find a way of being truly transformative in its work so that we can help drive the SDGs. And we chose to focus on the girl child because she was both the potential future unlocker of a lot of the energy that we need to get to the SDGs, but also, unfortunately, also in many societies, the least empowered. And that's the way that we have gone about thinking about our contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Well, and I can see there's still a lot of work to be done, so I wish you the very best, and indeed, you know, keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Edna. Thanks for having me.
And that was the CEO of Plan International there, ABLF Albrectsen. So we're so grateful that we had her here and to listen to all of the great work that Plan International is doing. We still have 2 more great interviews to come, so don't go away. Stay with us here on ABLF Talks. We will be right back.